Welcome all to our channel, and today we are going to be discussed about the top 15 Angular interview question and their answer with the step by step. So in this video we are going to learn and discuss about the one of the most important question asked on the Angular and answer of those questions. Also we are going to understand the fundamentals and the building blocks of the Angular by answering the most frequently asked interview question. Let's start and crack the round. So the first question asked on the Angular, what is meant by the Angular? So Angular was introduced to create the single page application, and Angular is a TypeScript based open source web application framework, and this is developed and maintained by the Google team rewrite the AngularJS, which is the JavaScript based, and announced the Angular 2 into the 2016. And Angular 2 is completely rewrite of the AngularJS, and it is written into the TypeScript. And this Angular 2 is known as the Angular. So it implements the core and optional functionality of the TypeScript library so that we can import into our application. Basically, Angular is a platform and the framework for building single page client application using HTML and TypeScript library. There were only two versions of the Angular. First is the AngularJS and next is the Angular 2, which is known as Angular. And the other version is enhancing into the Angular 2. So the second question is, what is difference between the AngularJS and the Angular version? So let's understand the difference by feature. First, we see the version. So the AngularJS is the first version which is released into the 2010, and Angular 2 is the second version which is released in 2016. Next feature is language. AngularJS use the JavaScript library, whereas Angular 2 use TypeScript, JavaScript, Dart, PureScript, and etc. So it has a more support on the languages. Next feature is the architecture. JavaScript is supports on model view controller design, and Angular is a component based and the directive based architecture. Next feature is mobile support. AngularJS does not support the mobile devices, whereas Angular supports all our mobile browsers and the devices. Next feature is reusability of the code. In the AngularJS, we cannot reuse the code which is written into that. Whereas in the Angular 2, we have the facility to reuse the code by using the services and other features. So hope you understand the difference between the AngularJS and Angular. So let's move to the next question. So next question asks on what are the core features of the Angular. So the first feature of Angular or Angular 2 is a component based architecture. So in Angular 2, everything works around the component. So component is a main building block for the Angular. So if you want any page to be created or run, you must have the component to be created. So it's a component based and you can work with the directives. Second feature is a module. Angular module is used to group the related component directives into the one part. Basically, Angular is a modular framework. Next feature is performance. Performance is better than the AngularJS because the execution is very fast when we perform any operation into the Angular. Next feature is a change detection. So it is an important feature of the Angular. It refreshes the running application whenever code changes is made into our code. Next feature is dependency injection. So dependency injection is one of the most important feature, like it is inbuilt into the Angular. We can get the dependencies, the constructor of the component. Next feature is a testing. When we work on the Angular project, we can easily test the application by creating the test cases using the different libraries. So hope you understand the core feature of the Angular, and if you are like the video, please do like and comment if you have any suggestion. Let's move to the next question. So next question is, what is single page application? Basically, single page application is a web application or a website. So it contains menu, button, blocks on a single page, and whenever user click, it dynamically rewrite the current page rather than loading the entire new page from the server. So it helps to improve the performance of the application. So single page application basically does not load new HTML page to display the content. Instead of, it generates dynamically and appends into the application. So next question is, what are the decorators into the Angular? So decorators are a design pattern or the function that defines how Angular feature work. They are used to make modification to the classes, services, or filter. So there are different type of the decorator available into the Angular. The first decorator is a class decorators. So class decorator allow us to tell Angular that particular class component or a model. For example, we have a @component and @ng model. Next, we have the property decorator. This is the second most common decorator that we are using within our Angular application. We can create the specific properties with the class with the help of property decorators, and we can use them when communication happens between parent to child or child to parent. So we have @input and @output property decorators available into the Angular. Next decorator is a method decorator. So method decorators are most common decorator that we are using within Angular application. We can create specific method within our class with the required functionality. For example, we can keep the host listener, like we can get the right click event and the event that happens to your DOM. Next decorator is a parameter decorators. Parameter decorators are also important and play important role within an Angular application. We can use when we have to inject parameter. The example of the parameter decorator is @inject. So these are the decorators available into the Angular. Now let's move to the next question. Next question is what is component into the Angular? So the component is a main building block of the Angular. Component contains data and user interaction logic that defines how the views look. A view in Angular refers to the HTML template. According to the Angular team, a component controls a path of the screen with the real state that we call to the view and declare reusable UI building blocks for the application. Basically, the Angular components are plain TypeScript classes and it's defined using @component decorator. Now let's move to the next question. Next question is, what is data binding and the types of the data binding? So basically, data binding is a mechanism that binds the application UI or user interface to the models. So using data bind, the user will able to manipulate the element present into the website using the browser. So whenever some variable has been changed, the particular change must be reflected into the DOM, that is document object model. So in Angular, data binding defines the interaction between the component and the DOM. Angular provided two types of the data binding technique. First is a one-way data binding and second is a two-way data binding. So one-way data binding is a simple type of the data binding where you allow to manipulate the view through model. That means if you made the change into the TypeScript code, that will reflect into the corresponding HTML into the one-way data. So one-way data binding has a different types. So it has a interpolation or string interpolation. Then we have the property binding, class binding, attribute binding. So these are the one-way data binding techniques. So in two-way, basically Angular allow to bind the data in a two-way. Means when you change the data into the TypeScript code, it will reflect into the UI. Similarly, if you change the data into the UI, it will reflect into your TypeScript code. So this is the two-way data binding technique. So if you want to understand the data binding technique in more detail, you can check our video for details. So we have given the link into the description and also you can check from the I button. So now let's move to the next question. So this is an important question which is asked by the every interviewer. Like, what is the lifecycle hook of the Angular? Basically, component goes through the different phases until its end. So Angular is responsible for maintaining and taking care of all these phases. So the first phase of the life cycle is a constructor. So it is called first and always. So this will call first and always whenever you load the page. Next, we have the ng on changes. So it's called when Angular sets or resets or change the data bound input property. So whenever you work with the parent-child communication and you change the some property, input property, at that time ng on changes get called. Next lifecycle hook is ng on init. It's called when component get initialized. So whenever component get initialized and after initialization, if you want to perform some operation on that basis, so ng on init is a place where you have to do the operation. The sequence which I am telling you, this is the sequence of the life cycle. So you have to keep the remember, this is the way of the execution of the life cycle hook. Next method is ng do check. So it's called when any changes detection occur. We have change detection feature available into the Angular, and that is work with the ng do check. So if you want to work with the change detection, then you need to work ng do check lifecycle hook is ng after content init. So it's respond after Angular project external content get implemented. So basically it's work on the external content into the component view. Next is ng after content check. So it checks the content projected into Angular view or not. Next we have ng after view init. So it initializes the component views and child views. So if you work with the parent-child communication, if you work with the nested and parent-child, if you want to make sure that both views are loaded, then this is the place we have to check. Next we have the ng after view check. It is check like the views and the child views are initialized or not. Next we have the ng destroy. So this is the last step of the lifecycle hook where it's clean up and destroy the directives and the component of the Angular. So hope you understand the lifecycle hook of the Angular. Next question is what is module in Angular? In Angular, a module is a mechanism to group the component, directives, pipes, and services that are related with each other in such a way that we can combine with other module to create an application. So basically every Angular application must have the default module, and that is app module.ts. So now let's look at the model into the Angular project. This is the project I created for tutorial. And if you go in the app, we have a module created here that is app.module.ts. And if you open this, it has a declaration imports. So as we discussed, it is a consist of component modules. We can use the pipes directives here, and that can be exported, and this module can be used into the next module. So it is a group of related which we are going to be used into the other. Hope you understand the modules into the Angular. Now let's move to the next question. What is directives in Angular and types of the directive available into the Angular? In Angular, directive help us to manipulate the DOM. We can change the appearance, behavior, or layout of the DOM using directives. So there are three types of the directives available into the Angular. So with the help of that directives, we can manipulate or change the style of our application. So let's see what are those directives. First, we have the component directive. So components are a special directive in Angular. They are the directive template. Basically, component is a directive because if you go to the component and see, we have a decorator @ component. So it's a directive for Angular application. So this is a tricky question asked by the interviewer whether component is a directive or what. So you should be clear on that. Component is a directive into the Angular. Next, we have a structural directives. Structural directives can change the DOM element layout by adding and removing the DOM element. All the structural directives are preceded by asterisk symbol. For example, we have ng for ng switch and ng if. So if you want to render some HTML element on the base of the switch case, or if you want to render the list with the help of, you can use the ng for and ng if you want to hide and show something on the basis of condition. You can use these structural directives as per your need. Next, we have the attribute directives. So attribute directives are used to style your application. Attribute directives is called as style directive that can change the appearance and behavior of element. So that these directives are used like ng model, ng class, and ng style. So with the help of this model, you can dynamically bind the class from on the condition basis or from the TypeScript code. So you can use this directive as per your need. And the next question is, what is service in Angular? Basically, Angular service perform tasks that we are going to be used by the multiple component. That means this is used for sharing the data between multiple component. We are using the service in Angular mainly for reusability of the code. Means we can write the code into the one place and that can be used by the multiple component. If you need same code in many components, then we can create the services as per our need. So basically, services perform all the operational tasks for the component and avoid rewriting of the code. We need to keep in mind services is defined using @injectable decorator. So function defined inside the service can be invoked from any component or directive. So now let's move to the next question. So next question is, what is difference between observable and promise? So this is actually most common question you need to understand. So now let's see the difference between them. The first difference is a declarative difference. Means when observable declare, so it does not call immediately when it creates, whereas the promise is executed when it creates. For the observable, until and unless you subscribe that observable, it is not execute, whereas the promise, it is executed immediately. Next, we have the values. So observable work with the multiple values, whereas the promise, it returns and work with the one value. Next, we have the error handling. So in observable, we have the subscribe method to use the error handling, whereas the promise, we push the errors to the child promises. Next is the chaining of the complex object. Basically, observable provide chaining and subscription to handle the complex application. So we have the different map and all the operation available into the observable, where in the promise we can use only dot then clause. So this is the basic difference. If you keep this, remember, you will definitely clear this question. So now let's move to the next question. And the next question is, what are the Angular HTTP interceptor? So HTTP interceptor are a part of @Angular common HTTP, which is inspect and transfer the HTTP request from your application to the server. And it could be vice versa for the HTTP response. So this interceptor can perform different tasks. So there are some variety of the interceptor available and that can be used for into the application. We can implement the interceptor for the authentication. Then we can implement the interceptor for the logging. Then we can implement interceptor for the caching. If you want to cache something, then you can implement the HTTP interceptor. Then we can implement the for fake backend. So if you don't have the API and you want a fake backend to be run, then in that case, you can simply extend the HTTP interceptor and create your own interceptor. Next, we have the URL transformation, and next we have the modifying headers. So basically modifying headers, if you want to append something each time into the HTTP request into the header, in that case, you can use and implement modifying headers. So these are the interceptors available into the Angular. You can implement many more as per your requirements. These are the tasks or core feature which we can use the interceptor. So next question, and one of the most important question in the Angular, is how to communicate or share the data between the two components. So basically you must understand, when you work with the Angular application, you must understand how you are going to share the data between the different component with the different cases. So basically there are 5 ways to share the data. First way is parent to child communication. So we can pass data from parent to child component using @input decorator and bind the property. So with the help of @input decorator, you can declare the property and passes to the child component. Next, communication happens between child to parents. So using event emulator and passing data from child component to the parent in the form of event with the help of output decorators. We can use output decorator to pass the data from child component to parent component with the help of event emitter. Basically, event emitter emits the events and that event is received by the parent component. Next, communication is use child component methods and properties. Basically, the @view child decorator can be used to access the child components public properties and methods. Next way is one component to many or other non-relational component. Basically, if you want to pass data between one component to other and that are not related to each other, so we can use RxJS, behavior subject, and subject observable services. So basically, these are the services which is used for the non-relational component. Next, we have the browser session storage. We can also store the data into the browser memory, access data sessions in the particular form or a particular component by using local storage or session storage. So these are the way to pass the data between the component, between the related component or non-related component. So now let's move to the next question. So next question is, what are the key components of the Angular? So basically there are 5 components which is important or key components of the Angular. First is component, main building block of the application to control the HTML view. Next, we have the modules. Angular model is a set of Angular basic building blocks like component, directive, services, etc. Next, we have a templates. So this represents the view of the Angular application. Next, we have the services. So it is basically used to share the data between the across and the entire application. Next, we have the metadata. So metadata is a collection of the metadata of the particular decorators. So these are the key components of the Angular. Hope you get the good information from this Angular interview video tutorial. So if you have any questions which is not covered into our this video, please do comment, and if you like, do subscribe and share. So we will meet in our next video. Thank you.